The front door shattered inward with a deafening crack, wood splinters flying down the narrow hallway like deadly hail. Shouts erupted. On the floor, hands pressed against his head, old Malcolm Reed dropped to his knees. He watched, frozen, as his son Eli was slammed against the living room wall. Blood trickled from Eli's temple where his head had struck the bookshelf. Glass glittered in fractured patterns, and a family portrait lay broken in shards. Their old Labrador mix, Rudy, barked in panic. Neighbors appeared at windows, phones raised. Malcolm whispered through clenched teeth, "Call General Sampson." The scene unfolded like something out of a nightmare that Malcolm had long buried beneath the quiet rhythm of his days. But now, everything had changed. The house, once a sanctuary of old wood and gentle conversation, was filled with chaos and the acrid scent of fear. Eli, stunned and struggling to regain his footing, clutched his head, eyes wide and wild. The agents, 5 or 6 of them, all clad in black tactical gear, moved with military precision. Their faces were hidden behind dark visors, their rifles aimed directly at Malcolm and his son. On the ground, one of the officers barked, his voice harsh, like a blade cutting through the air. But Malcolm didn't move. He couldn't. He couldn't risk making a wrong move, not now. His heart thudded in his chest, but his mind remained cold, calculating. There was only one thing he could do. "Call General Sampson," he repeated, this time louder, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. He wasn't just any man. He wasn't just an old carpenter living out his days in a sleepy town. He was Malcolm Reed, veteran, strategist, and someone with enough pull to turn this situation on its head. Another agent stepped forward, hands firmly gripping Eli's arms, twisting them behind his back. Eli winced, his breath shallow, but Malcolm remained calm. He knew that if he reacted, if he let panic slip into his movements, it could mean the difference between life and death. Through the haze of confusion and the ringing in his ears, Malcolm's thoughts sharpened. His entire life had led him to this moment. He was no stranger to conflict, no stranger to the weight of responsibility, to the burden of protecting those he loved. And now, in his own home, it was no different. "General Sampson," he whispered again, more to himself than anyone else. This was his only hope. His son's life, the integrity of his home, everything depended on this call. Willow Creek, California, nestled between oak-covered hills and winding roads layered in golden light at sunset. Malcolm Reed, 65, widowed, former military intelligence officer turned master carpenter, lived in the modest home he'd built himself. With deep-set steel-gray eyes, a quiet firmness, and hands calloused by decades of woodwork, he wore a faded olive cap that whispered of his old service. His workshop, out back, was his sanctuary. He crafted church pews, baby cradles, and community gifts. Eli, 24, Malcolm's only child, had dropped out of community college after his mother's death. With gentle features and a cautious smile, Eli biked to work at the hardware store, spent afternoons sanding planks beside his dad. Their bond was one of silent respect. Malcolm taught through example, and Eli learned with quiet intention. The house was simple, sturdy, built to last, just like everything Malcolm had ever known. He'd spent years designing it, drawing up plans by candlelight in his old Navy quarters, studying every beam, every nail, every joint as though each had a meaning, each a story to tell. When the house was finished, it stood proudly at the edge of Willow Creek, a symbol of hard-earned peace after a life of service. Malcolm wasn't a man who enjoyed the spotlight. He never wore his medals, never boasted of his achievements. His military record was impeccable, 3 silver stars, a legacy of missions across the globe. He had been a strategist, a thinker in the shadows, but the public face of Malcolm Reed was the quiet man who spent his days in his workshop, carving wood and carving out a life of solitude with his son. Eli, on the other hand, hadn't chosen to follow in his father's footsteps. The death of his mother when he was only 16 had changed him. It had made him distant, unsure of his place in the world. After her funeral, he had dropped out of college. Malcolm had tried to talk to him about it, to guide him back into the fold of the future. But Eli wasn't ready to listen. He wasn't sure he could. At night, they'd sit in the small living room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Malcolm would sometimes look over at Eli, wondering what his son was thinking. Eli would never say much, his eyes always distant, like he was in another place entirely. It was as if the world had taken something from him, and he wasn't sure what he could offer in return. But when they worked together, when Eli helped him with the heavy lifting, the sanding, the cutting, Malcolm saw a different side of his son. There was something in the quiet way Eli focused, in the way he touched the wood with reverence. It was in these moments, Malcolm thought, that his son was most like him. No words were needed, just the steady rhythm of hands at work, side by side. Still, despite their shared moments, Malcolm could never fully understand what Eli was feeling. What had happened to him after his mother died? What had he been hiding all these years? It wasn't until later, much later, that Malcolm would start to understand just how deep the wounds ran. But that night, just before the storm of chaos broke through their door, the two of them had been in the workshop again, just like any other evening. The smell of freshly cut wood hung in the air, and Eli had been sanding a plank, humming softly under his breath. The evening had been calm, peaceful even. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, an uneasy silence settled in, one that Malcolm couldn't shake. In the back of his mind, he thought of those quiet hours spent with General Samson, a man whose presence was never far from his thoughts. Samson had been the one to recruit him all those years ago, the one who had seen something in Malcolm that no one else had. A strategist. A man with the mind to match his heart. But the call never came. Not that night. Not that hour. And as Malcolm stood there in his hallway, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding before him, he realized just how much had changed, and just how much was about to break apart. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about something far more dangerous. A world that had forgotten who he was. As the town prepared for its autumn harvest festival, Malcolm worked late on a new stage, measuring and cutting long after dark. Eli kept him company, mopping sweat from his forehead, and laughing at one of his dad's old sea captain jokes. The town, with its oak-lined streets and humble cottages, was known for its sense of community. The festival was something everyone looked forward to, the scent of fresh pies, children running through the pumpkin patch, neighbors catching up over coffee, and the kind of light-hearted camaraderie that only a small town could foster. But even as the preparations unfolded, there was a quiet tension in the air. It wasn't anything Malcolm could pinpoint with his hands or his eyes, but he could feel it, gnawing at the edges of his peace. The world outside had changed. The tension in the air wasn't just a passing storm, it was something deeper, something that had started to take root in ways that Malcolm couldn't ignore. For weeks, whispers had come through the local bar, from the few remaining veterans still in town, and even from the neighbors who weren't part of the old guard. There was something wrong, they said. Something the town didn't want to talk about. Something that had started when the government sent agents into nearby towns to clear up certain records, to track down people that had slipped through the cracks. The whispers always carried a note of fear. Malcolm had always stayed away from politics. His was a life built on hard work and craftsmanship. But as he worked late into the night, the glow of the work lamp casting long shadows across the unfinished stage, he couldn't help but notice how things were slowly shifting. He had built this stage with his own hands, each beam, each board a testament to his skill and patience. This festival was supposed to be a celebration, a moment where the community could come together and enjoy the fruits of their labor. But now, in the midst of it, there was a different kind of labor to be done. The kind that wasn't as easily measured. Malcolm was well aware of the unspoken shifts in power, how every inch of territory seemed to be claimed by unseen forces. The small-town sheriff, once a figure of trust, had started attending meetings with men Malcolm didn't recognize. There were murmurs of new federal initiatives, investigations, and the promise of increased government oversight. People had started looking over their shoulders more often. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a kind of dread, a tightening in his chest that wasn't caused by the steady work of his hands. And yet, his own son, Eli, remained oblivious to it all. It was almost as if the younger man lived in his own bubble, content with his quiet life at the hardware store, unaware of the encroaching storm that Malcolm could see gathering on the horizon. It was late into the evening, with the sounds of the town's preparations drifting through the open windows of their workshop, when the first real signs of the trouble came. It wasn't the loud sirens or the heavy boots of agents storming the door. It was something more subtle, more insidious. A strange visitor. The knock came just as they were finishing up for the night. Eli, never one to stand on ceremony, stood up with a stretch. His back was sore from hours of sanding, but it was the kind of soreness that came from doing something right. "Don't know who that is," Eli said, wiping his brow, "but I'll get it." Malcolm didn't stop him. Maybe it was because he'd grown accustomed to Eli being the one who handled the small things, the routine things. But as Eli walked to the door, Malcolm felt a strange unease wash over him. When Eli opened the door, the figure standing outside wasn't anyone they knew. A man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He was holding a briefcase, which he carefully placed on the porch before offering Eli a brief nod. "I'm looking for Malcolm Reed," the man said, his voice low and clipped. Eli hesitated but stepped aside to allow the stranger in. Malcolm had already stood up by the time the man entered the workshop, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the well-dressed figure before him. The man didn't waste any time. "I'm here on government business," he said, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Just a few questions. We've been reviewing some of the military records from years ago, and there's been some discrepancies. Small things, really. We just want to ensure everything is in order." Malcolm had seen enough in his life to know when something wasn't right. He knew the subtle signs, the forced politeness, the way the man avoided eye contact, the rigidness of his posture. Malcolm was no stranger to intelligence work, and he immediately realized what was happening. "They've come for you, haven't they?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady but with an edge of bitterness that even he hadn't expected. He knew where this was heading. It was inevitable. The paperwork had been scrutinized. The records had been flagged. It didn't matter that Malcolm hadn't been active in decades, hadn't worn a uniform for longer than most of the agents had been alive. The man didn't respond directly, but his eyes gave away everything Malcolm needed to know. They weren't here for a friendly visit. They weren't here for any legitimate reason. They were here because someone had decided that the past, his past, needed to be revisited. The question was, why now? "Just making sure everything's cleared up," the man said again, his voice far less convincing now. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He understood. This wasn't about clearance. This was about control. It was about tearing down the people who, like him, had once given everything to the country, only to be discarded when they no longer served a purpose. He could feel the walls of his home closing in, and with them, the unspoken weight of everything that was about to change. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Malcolm Reed wasn't someone who could be easily erased. The question wasn't if he'd fight back, but when. The next morning at 6:15, tire screeches outside jolted Malcolm awake. Through the window, he saw an unmarked black van flanked by silent agents. Before he could act, the door exploded inward. Rudy barked, his fur bristling with panic. Eli stumbled bleary-eyed into the hallway, his hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun he kept above the door, too slow, too late. The door was already on the ground, splintered beyond recognition, the dark silhouettes of agents flooding into their home. "Get on the floor," a voice barked, rough and demanding, and Malcolm knew in that instant that no amount of reasoning or pleading would stop them. He could see the gleam of rifles and the tactical boots stamping over the broken door frame. "Eli!" Malcolm shouted, even as he dropped to his knees, pressing his hands to his head, trying to shield his mind from the surge of adrenaline rushing through him. His son, still half asleep, was quickly shoved back by two agents, their gloved hands forcing him toward the floor. Eli groaned, struggling against their grip, but the agents were unrelenting. Malcolm's mind raced. What had gone wrong? He had never once imagined it would escalate like this, not in his own home. For a moment, he considered whether to fight back. He could grab the tools he kept in the workshop, some of them deadly enough for men trained in combat. But no. The odds were against them. 1,000 scenarios played out in his head, but none of them felt like they would lead to a victory. Instead, he forced himself to remain calm, watching every move. The black-clad figures moved like shadows, their steps purposeful, calculated. Their radios crackled with hushed voices, and their cold stares were all Malcolm needed to understand. They had come with intent, and nothing he did or said would change that. In a flash, one of the agents was on top of Eli, cuffing him roughly, pressing his face into the floor with a knee that felt like it could crack bone. Eli yelped in pain but didn't fight back, his body limp from sleep and confusion. A burning anger rose in Malcolm's chest, but he held it down, his eyes narrowing as the agents moved around the house. They weren't just here for the raid, they were here to intimidate, to break them. "Don't fight them," Malcolm whispered through clenched teeth. He wasn't sure if Eli heard, but the words hung in the air, a quiet plea for compliance. He knew they had no chance against these men, and the longer they resisted, the worse it would get. The town would know, of course, what had happened. The neighbors had no doubt already begun filming with their phones. The agents couldn't afford to be seen as overly aggressive, not when people would ask questions. Yet, as they moved through the house, tearing drawers out, flipping through old files, rifling through personal items with little regard for the sanctity of the home, it became clear that none of this had to do with justice. This was punishment. This was control. Malcolm could see it in the way they moved with such mechanical precision, as though they were erasing something, not just searching for it. Their eyes scanned every corner, the walls, the ceiling. "Clear," one of them shouted after going through the kitchen. But even then, they didn't stop. No. The search continued with unrelenting efficiency. Meanwhile, Eli's body remained stiff, his face pressed against the floor. The two agents that had grabbed him stood guard, their weapons trained on Malcolm, who still knelt with his hands behind his head, silently enduring the humiliation. Through it all, Rudy continued to bark, though no one paid him any mind. His dog's frantic cries bounced off the walls, a high-pitched wail of anxiety. The sound was a constant reminder of the madness unfolding in the home Malcolm had worked so hard to build. Then, the young agent who had been rifling through the drawers emerged from the living room, holding something small, something precious. His hand was extended before him, and in it, a silver star medal. His silver star medal rested in a blue velvet box. It caught the light, the polished surface of the star gleaming against the dim light of the house, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. "Sir," the agent said, his voice dropping for the first time from its earlier harshness. He held the medal forward, his eyes flicking nervously between Malcolm and the lead officer. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. The agent didn't need to say anything, the look on his face told Malcolm everything he needed to know. They had done their homework. They had found the records. They had seen the medals, the accolades. But they had overlooked the man himself, the quiet carpenter, the father. They had only seen a name on paper, a file to be checked, a target. The lead officer, a woman who had been silent until now, took the box from the agent's hands. She stared at it for a moment, her expression hardening as she turned it over in her hands. She looked at Malcolm, who met her gaze, steady as a rock, though a fierce knot twisted in his stomach. Her voice broke through the silence, colder now, as if the realization had somehow shifted her approach. This doesn't match the profile we have." Malcolm didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He had been through too much in his life to let a few misplaced words shake him. He knew that the moment the government had set its sights on him, nothing would ever be the same. But that didn't mean he was going to let them destroy his family, not without a fight. As the woman glanced at the agent who held the medal, she spoke again, her tone firmer, more commanding. "Call General Sampson," she ordered, and Malcolm heard the words as though a dam had been broken. The room grew still, the tension thick in the air like the silence before a storm. For a moment, everything seemed to hang on that single, whispered command. "Call General Sampson." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight far beyond their utterance. Malcolm knew that it was more than just a request, it was the turning point. It was his lifeline. And if General Sampson answered, everything would change. The officer, a woman with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, held the Silver Star medal in her hand, her fingers lightly caressing its surface as if she were trying to understand the incongruity of it all. It was clear now, the raid, the forceful entry, the overblown tactics, all of it had been a mistake. They had come for someone they thought they understood, someone they had reduced to a name in a file. But in that moment, they realized they had miscalculated. She turned toward the agent who had handed her the medal and gave a sharp nod. "Get on the secure line," she instructed, her voice laced with something approaching uncertainty. The young agent, looking uneasy, stepped back toward the wall and pulled out a small device from his belt. He flicked it on and immediately began speaking into it in a low tone, his words clipped and urgent. The other agents continued their search, but their movements had slowed, their eyes flicking back toward Malcolm and his son with a kind of hesitation. Even they seemed unsure now, their confidence faltering in the face of this unanticipated turn of events. Malcolm's eyes never left the woman. He remained kneeling, hands still clasped behind his head, but his mind was already 100 miles ahead, thinking through the steps that would come next. The game had changed, but that didn't mean it was over. As the seconds stretched on, Malcolm couldn't help but notice the looks exchanged between the agents. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him to be the one they were dealing with. Their unease was palpable. These were not the kind of men who made mistakes, not the kind of people who were used to being on the back foot. They were the ones who made others nervous, who controlled the flow of power. But now, they were on the defensive. Finally, the agent on the secure line turned to face his superior, his expression one of disbelief. "Ma'am, it's him. Malcolm Reed. Naval Intelligence. Bravo Protocol Author. 3 silver stars. The files, they're outdated." The woman's face went pale. The realization was sinking in. She looked at Malcolm, and for the first time since she'd entered the house, there was a flicker of something like respect, or was it fear, in her eyes. The hardened exterior she had worn so far seemed to crack, and in its place was something more human, recognition. Recognition of the mistake they'd made. Recognition of the man kneeling before them. Her voice was quieter now, as though the words she spoke were more for herself than for Malcolm. "You're Malcolm Reed." It wasn't a question, but more of a stunned acknowledgement, as if the weight of his name had only just landed with her. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Before Malcolm could respond, the agent who had been on the phone raised his hand, signaling the officer. She nodded and stepped aside. The agent quickly turned and walked over to one of the other men, a senior officer who had remained silent up until that point. The two of them huddled in the corner, speaking in low, hurried tones. Malcolm's mind was still racing. He could hear the faint buzz of the radio, the click of boots on the floor, but his focus was elsewhere, on the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, on the brief moments of stillness between the chaos. His eyes flicked to Eli, still on the floor, still being held down by one of the agents, though his expression had softened. He wasn't being dragged around anymore. There was a sense of quiet resignation in his eyes now, as though he understood that whatever this was, it wasn't personal. The young man had always been calm in the face of adversity, but this was different. This was the kind of pressure that broke most people, the kind of weight that drove men to crumble. The lead officer's voice broke through his thoughts once more. "I'll be making a call. You can expect a representative here shortly." Her eyes flicked toward the door, toward the scene unfolding outside. The neighbors were still gathered at the windows, the phones still raised. The agents had forgotten that the world was watching. They had forgotten that a mistake of this scale could not remain contained within the walls of Malcolm's house. The lead officer stepped aside, signaling to the other agents that the situation was under control, for now. The pressure wasn't off, but the storm was momentarily paused. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the tension seemed to ease, if only for a moment. Malcolm could hear the distant hum of the helicopter, the powerful rotors cutting through the air. That unmistakable sound, it was a sound he knew all too well. He'd heard it in the field, in operations that had taken him far from the quiet streets of Willow Creek. The noise only grew louder as the seconds passed. Through the open door, Malcolm saw the silhouette of the helicopter in the sky. It was coming. It was time. A moment later, the officer's voice came through again, this time not to him but into the radio. "Samson's on his way," she said, a reluctant admission, the words heavy with the understanding of the gravity of the situation. Malcolm remained still, waiting, watching. It was coming. He had fought in wars, yes, but this was something else, this was the war at home. And this time, it wasn't about strategy or tactics. This time, it was about a man reclaiming what was his. Within half an hour, a UH-72 Lakota helicopter descended onto the school's backfield, kicking up dust and leaves. The sound of the rotors was deafening, drowning out the usual morning birdsong and the murmurs of the gathered crowd. As the helicopter touched down, the air seemed to shift, the very earth beneath them vibrating with the power of the descent. It wasn't just any arrival, it was the arrival of the man who could end this, who could turn the tide. Cameras rolled, their lenses capturing every moment, every shift in the wind. General Samson's arrival wasn't a quiet affair. He emerged from the helicopter in a composed, controlled manner, his dark suit pressed sharp enough to cut glass. The golden insignia of his rank gleamed on his chest, a visual echo of the authority he wielded. A man who had seen it all, who had directed covert operations and made decisions that could alter the course of nations. To Malcolm, Samson wasn't just a superior officer, he was a reminder of everything he had left behind, a world of orders and secrecy, of high-stakes decisions made under the cover of darkness. Amanda Foster, the young officer who had ordered the raid, stood by the door of Malcolm's house. She was still processing the magnitude of the situation, her stance rigid and tense, as if waiting for some unseen reprimand. She didn't dare make eye contact with Malcolm or anyone else. She knew that her mistake was one that couldn't be easily fixed. The weight of it hung on her like an anchor, pulling her down. Samson's eyes scanned the crowd, the faces of the curious and the concerned, and then settled on Malcolm, standing alone on his porch. The old man's posture was straight, despite the weariness in his bones, a quiet dignity radiating from him that seemed to challenge the very nature of the chaos that had just unfolded in his home. As Samson walked toward the porch, the buzz of reporters intensified. Their questions ricocheted off the walls, desperate for answers, desperate for a story. "General, how could something like this happen?" one asked, thrusting a microphone into his face. "A decorated war hero, a former intelligence officer, how did the authorities get it so wrong?" Samson didn't respond immediately. He was focused, his eyes locked on Malcolm with an understanding that only years of experience could foster. He reached the porch and extended a hand to the older man, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than any formal salute. "Took you long enough," Malcolm said, his voice even, but laced with the sharpness of frustration. Samson's lips twitched into a thin smile. "I wasn't expecting you to be so patient," he said. His voice had that calm, Southern California drawl that had both the air of authority and a sense of ease, as if they were in a different world altogether, one where the rules had been bent for men like them. Malcolm shook his hand firmly but didn't let go. For a brief moment it was as if time slowed, as if the very history of their shared past was playing out in the quiet tension between them. There were no words for what they'd been through together, years of operation, of untold stories that neither of them would ever share with the public. But here they were, standing in the sunlight of an ordinary morning, and yet nothing about it was ordinary. Inside, Eli rested on the couch, a paramedic tending to his injuries, nothing severe, but the bruise on his temple was darkening by the minute, a mark of what had been. Malcolm glanced through the open door, his eyes softening as they landed on his son. Eli had always been quiet, but the trauma in his eyes was something Malcolm couldn't ignore. Eli wasn't just shaken, he was wounded by the fear and the violence of what had just unfolded. Malcolm's only request, his voice low but resolute, was simple: "I want my son to heal, and this street to be itself again." His words carried the weight of a father's plea, a man who had seen too much but who had never wavered in his desire to protect what was his. To protect the legacy that was not built on medals, not built on war, but built on something far simpler: family, home, and the right to live peacefully without fear. Samson nodded without hesitation. There was no question in his mind. The general's eyes darkened for just a moment, as if he were mentally processing the full scope of what had happened, of the people who had just been thrust into a battle they never signed up for. A moment later, the local journalists swarmed, their cameras flashing as they captured the first moments of what would surely become headline news. The air was thick with questions, with noise, with the sudden recognition of a story that was far bigger than a simple raid gone wrong. It wasn't just about the mistake of the raid anymore, it was about the unveiling of a man, the true Malcolm Reed, and the story of a hero who had been wrongly accused. The headline would soon read, "Malcolm Reed, decorated veteran, mistaken for criminal." It was a headline that didn't just speak to the errors of the law enforcement officials, but to the larger tragedy of a nation's failure to recognize those who had given so much. It was a headline that would carry Malcolm's name out into the world once more. As reporters shouted questions about the raid, about the missteps of the authorities, Malcolm found himself at the center of it all. And yet, it wasn't the story of his medals, or his past, that mattered now. No. It was the simple, quiet dignity of a man who had been wronged and was now being heard. At the hardware store, a reporter approached Malcolm with a question that had been on the lips of many. "General Samson has called for accountability, but do you think Amanda Foster deserves punishment for this?" After all, it was her command. Malcolm paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. Then, with a calmness that seemed to echo his years of training, he replied, "She learned. People who learn deserve second chances." It was a response that captured the heart of the matter, the true measure of justice. It wasn't about punishment, it was about redemption. The very core of Malcolm's belief had always been that people could change, that they could grow, that they could repair the damage they'd caused. Even in the face of such a devastating mistake, there was room for learning. Room for growth. As the crowd buzzed, Malcolm turned back to the house, his eyes settling on Eli once more, and for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point, not just for his family, but for the town itself. The quiet veneer of Willow Creek had cracked open, revealing the complicated layers beneath. And now, the world would see it. Justice restored.